This is the Fierce Heart Alliance. Our focus is spirituality with purpose, exquisite self-care, and conscious community. Hi, I'm Summer Sophia Moon, and I've come here to heal myself and chew bubblegum. And guess what? I'm all out of bubblegum. So join me and my special guests as we share and learn how to love ourselves fiercely through self-care and explore the wisdom of the harmonic virtues. These virtues are based on the laws of the universe and channeled wisdom to cultivate more resiliency, purpose, and harmony through self-care and self-awareness. By listening, you are now a fierce heart too. Welcome to the Fierce Heart Alliance. Before I begin today's topic, I'd like to say thank you to our listeners and our subscribers. You're always welcome here. We'd like to honor the indigenous peoples whose land we reside. Thank you for showing us how to be in harmony with Mother Earth. Thank you to the ancestors and spirit guides and friends who are assisting us here today. May these words be a force for good and timelessly infused with light and held in the frequency of rose quartz to spread healing and peace in the world around us. If there's any words left unsaid, we trust in spirit to make things right and let it gently ease into our consciousness as necessary for understanding in our own time and in our own way for the highest and most benevolent outcomes for all. And so it is. Thank you. Hey Fierce Hearts, today's episode is about the virtue of polarity. It's located on the inner level of the harmonic virtues called the metaphysical level, which are foundational elements of physical life and the building blocks of consciousness. Virtues are lessons that can impact our everyday life and relationships. They're aspects of us that are ever evolving, ever shifting, and developing as we mature. And like a beautiful garden, they require some tending and some management to keep healthy and vibrant. Today, my guest is Katrina Nilsson-Gorman. Katrina is a nature mystic, archetypal explorer, author, and soulful mentor. Her clients have called her a medicine woman who embodies lifetimes of deep cultivation work. She has a passion for connection, deep connection to the transpersonal realm, connection to village, and connection to land. Welcome, Katrina.
Thank you so much, Summer. I'm happy to be here.
Well, with your experience, what is your take on polarity and what does it mean to you?
Well, I'll tell you what, polarity has been a big theme in my personal life. I can tell you that, as well as something that I have been prompted to, because of life circumstances, really dive into in sort of a deep contemplative way. I mean, there's so much we could say about polarity, right?
Absolutely. Which direction do you want to go?
I think it really begins with this feeling that I feel like I've always had in me of like polarity and opposites. This feeling of like I'm one of those people that has had to in some ways live my life to extremes
Sure.
to find the middle ground, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah.
um And that's not to say I've, extremes as in like skydiving and stuff like that. But I would say in some ways, extremes in an internal way. I remember growing up and feeling like I always used to take those personality tests and things like that. And people would ask these questions and I would be kind of 50-50 in so many cases, like I would be very extroverted in one moment and very introverted in another, something
Mhm.
like that. I kept seeing this pattern popping up over and over again in my experience, where it was, either I'm this or I'm that, and both of those things seem really opposite to one another. I feel like this is a contemplation that, as all contemplations are in some way, shape, or form, is a contemplation that really has to be lived into to really be understood, right? I would say that I am someone who is an extremely deep feeler. Sometimes I feel like I feel these deep, sort of dark emotions so intensely. And then I also can feel these incredibly light, divine sort of emotions very intensely as well. It's been a journey for me to understand what that's about. I think a really good story to kind of lean into that a little bit is when I was in my early 20s, I went through this series of workshops with this woman who was maybe one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. She would never call herself this, but she was absolutely a shamanic archetype
Mm.
embodied. And she herself had traveled to some really, really dark depths and was very impassioned to help people move through those areas of their lives. She had this model that she called the pendulum. She used this model throughout the workshop as a way to show how we were going to navigate the workshop. And so basically, if you can imagine a pendulum, like a stand holding a string that has maybe a ball or something attached to it. And one side that the pendulum can swing to is fear. And one side that the pendulum can swing to, the other side, is love. And what she said is, okay, if I bring the ball and swing it a little bit into the side of love or into the side of fear, it might swing back into love, but then back into fear and back sort of into the center, right? But if we take that ball and really bring it all the way up and to the side of fear, like all the way up into that fear, and here's the important part, let go, to the same extent will it swing back into love. That was how she conducted her workshop, was using polarities. Like, she took us into some places that were really, like, we had to face fears, right? We had to go deep into those areas that none of us really want to go, you know? As a result, the natural swing was to be able to have more capacity to experience and be love, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and it was the first time in my life where I was like, wow, I think that's what my soul does, like what it wants to do. It really wants to explore these deeper realms for some reason that in some ways doesn't, some of the things that I'm interested in and that are, you know, like deeper and darker isn't, you know, necessarily societally kosher. I've always been interested in things that are like, I've always been interested in the subject of death and dying and what is death, and you know, how do we dive into those things, and you know, it's mysterious, you know. I've always had a passion for things that are mysterious and things that we don't really know about. And we live in such a mechanistic sort of culture where we don't always have our minds set on mystery, right? We don't allow there to be room for mystery. And
Absolutely.
and so I guess there was just always a part of me that was like, I want to go to that place. I want to figure out what's down there. And part of it is the the satisfaction of going there and you know, solving some mysteries, but part of it is also living in the mystery. Has always
Yes.
been just so profoundly important to me. Through that experience, I feel like by going deeper, I've become strangely and paradoxically lighter. Yeah, that's kind of just in a nutshell what I think about polarity. I've done a lot of deep studies into archetypal forms of polarity, but I'm sure we can talk a little bit about that. We'll take a pause there.
So, before we go further, a little bit about archetypes. The word is used a lot in this episode, and so I thought I would just mention what an archetype is. And it's been used throughout history to describe a combination of traits that compartmentalizes them into characters. And archetypes date back as far as Plato and are used in creative works such as stories, movies, and music. And so Carl Jung's work and his utilization of psychological archetypes helped to bring the term back into the mainstream. The hero, the victim, the lover, the magician, the trickster, the sage, the judge, the artist, and the rebel are all different kinds of archetypes, and it doesn't end there. And you can find archetypes in any kind of work, any story. There's usually some sort of arrangement that we all can kind of understand who the character is. So that's a little bit about it. On with the show. Can you elaborate a little bit more of the archetypal interpretation of polarity?
Yeah. So much here. We could talk for
Roll up
many
the sleeves.
about this. The first time I noticed polarity in archetypes was that I've always had, like I told you, this intrigue or this attraction to mystery or things that are unknown, right? And one of those things when I was a kid, it was sort of this closet passion of mine, was at the time, now it's my living passion, but at the time was tarot and astrology. I started my exploration of these things at a really young age, actually. I was maybe 10 or so when my mom actually bought me a tarot deck because she saw that I was at a Barnes and Noble and I had just like hearts in my eyes when I saw that for the first time. And so she got it for me for Christmas. And I mean, I still have it. Like I can see it next to me. It's like completely tattered at this point from like I've used it so many times. Yeah, that took me into this archetypal realm of exploration of story and of characters. And that was like my first sort of introduction to that. And then of course, in conjunction with that, I started to get into astrology as, just, very curious, in terms of we just see horoscopes, right? That's the first thing people see when they think of astrology.
Yeah.
Just, your horoscopes that you see in the magazine or the newspaper or whatever. I just had this knowing or this feeling that there was something much more to that. And I was so like, oh, what? Okay, it's time to take a deeper dive. What's that? I found out that my horoscope sign, according to back then, what I would call my horoscope sign back then, was Libra, which was this archetypal representation of scales, right? I've kept that image in my mind throughout my life of these scales. And what are scales? They're here to sort of measure out polarity to get to an equal plane. I've done some sort of deeper contemplations on that growing up, how that has played out. I won't get too deep into that perhaps, but that was kind of my starting point. And during many parts of my life where things just didn't make sense, I started going down these rabbit holes of interest into archetype and astrology specifically, and found my way to ancient Hellenistic astrology, which is something that I practice now. This was very intriguing to me because essentially it's an old but a new practice, because in the 1990s there were these group of linguists who were also closet astrologers that ended up translating these ancient Greek texts that had basically all of the old methods for conducting astrological readings.
Wow.
And so they translated these, and now like really that's the basis of what I use to conduct astrology readings, through diving into this deep, endless ocean of archetypal exploration, which is wonderful. I probably will never stop learning about it, to be quite honest. You start to realize the way that the astrological system is set up. It's basically an observation of nature.
Mm-hmm.
In nature, there is a pattern of cycles. Everything is a circle, as you demonstrated before with the flower of life. The flower of life is indeed made up of circles, right? Everything has a circle to it. It's very, very interesting. Sort of just a facet of our reality. Within those circles, there's different points. You could mark 4 different points to do the 4 directions. And within those 4 different points, you'll see that all of a sudden we have opposites occur. So we have north and south, east and west. Those are perceptually, opposite to one another. And so you start to set up an astrological chart, which essentially is a circle with different pie slices, 12 different pie slices, and each of those pie slices has an opposite pie slice, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you got 12 different zodiac signs. So you start contemplating, okay, polarity is a thing that exists in our experience. And you can go deep into these sort of contemplations about what that might mean. And so I was getting into this method of learning and conjunct to that, around 2019, I started dating my now partner, who is a Chinese medicine doctor. He just introduced me to this whole world of Taoist philosophy. And within Taoist philosophy, we have wonderful, wonderful access to the idea of polarity. So we've got the idea of yin and yang. I started getting into this, and then of course, I got my hands on the I Ching, which is basically I Ching directly translates to the Book of Changes. And it's an ancient form of, well, they used it for many things, not just divination. They used it for medicine and so many other math and so many other things, but it's an ancient form of Chinese divination, essentially. What it is an observation of how yin, the sort of deep, dark, cold, they call it sometimes feminine principle, versus the yang, the bright, active, light, what they sometimes called masculine principle, interact with one another in the world. So the I Ching is made up of 64 different hexagrams. And hexagrams are different combinations of yin and yang. And so basically, it's just this coding for how the world is made up of polarities. The study of how there's all these different polarities, how they work together, how they create elements that interact with one another. And then, of course, the I Ching is the book of changes, right? So how do these elements correspond and change? Like, what is their dance? Sometimes when we think about polarity, I think we think about polarity being a still sort of stuck static thing, but actually polarity can be a movement. It can be a literal dance. I always like to imagine like two dance partners, dancing with one another. What's also very interesting is that we can compare that even to, in our modern day culture, strangely, binary code.
Sure. Yeah.
Right?
Ones and zeros. Yeah.
Ones and zeros. And binary code is what, all of our digital stuff is made out of. So, some computer scientist, back in the day found out that, I almost wonder if they knew about the I Ching or had studied Taoism or had some flavor of that in their construction. I don't actually know what the history of binary code is, to be quite honest. That would be interesting to investigate. But yeah, there's ones and zeros. It's like the zero is the nothingness, which is like yin, right? The void, the darkness. And the one is like the yang, the light that comes out of the darkness. I also think that it's fascinating to contemplate why we would perceive our world this way, even though, okay, this is what we see in our reality is this binary, is this yin and yang. But also, humans have two hemispheres of their brain, right?
Yeah.
This is just something that we're constructed as. And so I think we're naturally predisposed to see the world in polarity. Yeah, these are kind of like tip of the iceberg sort of things, but these are things that I have kind of contemplated and noticed the patterns of, been into deeper waters with. So
yeah. Wow. Yeah, you definitely touched on a lot of things. I too see polarity as being the contrast between two big concepts or feelings, emotions, or ideas and whatnot. And I really love what you talked about, the love and the fear. And in another podcast, we do talk about how there's really only two emotions. There's love and there's fear. And it's also the parable of two wolves. Which one are you going to feed? And so the idea of the pendulum, that's so great. And you can use that pendulum idea with any sort of polarity setup, and the light and the dark. And I totally agree. There's life and there's death. There's the duality of both of them. And absolutely the shadow that you're talking about diving into versus society, versus what society wants us to or expects of us, and especially for women, and I would even say for men too, for all of us, and regardless of your gender, even though we're kind of touching on gender, regardless of what you identify with, there's going to be emotions that we show to the world, and then there's emotions that we withhold from the world, and that deep dive into the darkness. And I've actually worked with spirit guides, and you know they think about goddesses and gods and deities and whatnot. And actually a spirit guide that's really been working me lately, well, actually not lately, for the past like 5 years or something like that, is the dark goddess.
Mm.
And oh boy, and it's that fear and that darkness, that like pulling into the fear side of the pendulum is, she pushes you into that, and pushes your hand to the fire and holds your hand to the stove, because it's for your own good. Like, you need to experience this, you need to let this go, you need to see this fear for what it is, and is it true? And oftentimes it isn't. And so then you have to witness, you have to see, you have to experience this fear and process it, and embody it, and then release it, like you said, let it go. And then whoosh, you have to go into the darkness in order to experience the light. I totally feel that. That was really fascinating what you're talking about, the archetype. And I was thinking, and I never even thought about this. And I also, I know a little bit about tarot, but like, the idea is that there's opposites, and to think about opposites being within the astrological chart and whatnot. That's a really cool concept. Thank you for bringing that up. And so how do you've kind of talked about how you recognize polarity in your life, but like day to day, what would you say that you're like, oh, well, that's one and that's one over there? And like, what would you say?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because in astrology we have these different things called aspects. So we look at how one planet is aspecting another. In other words, what angle is a planet to another planet when it's traveling through the sky? And sometimes two planets might be literally opposite to one another in the sky. So we call that an opposition. We essentially attribute that, the idea of opposition, the nature of opposition, to the archetypal planet of Saturn, the idea of Saturn. I'll tell you a little bit about how this applies to my everyday life.
Sure. Yeah.
But just to get there, Saturn in ancient astrology was a very interesting character. And the ancient Greek pantheon, we talk about him as Kronos, the the purveyor of time and timelessness. He's kind of like this really fierce, kind of scary old man figure, but also has a lot of wisdom. And Saturn also rules boundaries. So in the ancient world, when they looked up and they saw planets in the sky, Saturn was the planet that was the farthest away from us that they could see with the naked eye. And so they had this idea that because of that, Saturn lived on the edge of the known universe. Essentially, there was this idea that Saturn was the edge dweller. Saturn ruled opposites because Saturn was opposite to the sun, in the sense that it was the farthest away from the sun. We've got the sun that's almost like the embodiment of pure yang, just like bright, white, like constant energy flow. And then we've got Saturn that's in this cold, dark, distant sort of like edge of the known, like before the void. That's why we think about Saturn in terms of opposition. When we see Saturn in the sky, we also think those archetypal ideas of polarity and opposition might come into our lives in some way, shape, or form. So to answer your question, I often am looking for Saturn in my life. And usually I don't have to stumble too far to find it. Saturn is in ancient astrology was sometimes called malefic, or, you know, which kind of sounds scary. It sounds like, oh, it's the bad planet. But essentially, malefics aren't necessarily bad, but they're things that cause us to stop and really hone in on the challenges in our lives and to try to figure out our challenges. You know, Saturn shows up for me in many ways, both in ways that are subjectively pleasant and unpleasant. But I would say the thing that Saturn rules that is helpful for me is discipline. So I have sort of a complicated relationship with discipline, perhaps. Um, but there is a sense that, like, in the morning, where when you want to get up and do your morning routine, right? That's actually very Saturnian thing to do, is like have a nice sort of like, all right, first I go outside and I meditate and then I come inside, and there's just sort of like a rhythm. Saturn rules boundaries, right? It's on the boundary of the known world. Yeah, and then there's also this sort of necessary, sometimes, rebellion against Saturn, which can be like that solar energy. You know, like sometimes even like working too hard for some sort of solar principle of just like run, 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 go, 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 that sort of stuff can be like where Saturn comes in and says, yes, we want you to work hard, but if you work hard, you're going to get sick, you know?
Right. Yeah.
So it can go like, you know, I feel like there's this constant ticker in my mind of like, am I doing too much work or too little? Am I doing too much of this or too little? You know, like, what is the right amount? And if I do this, like, is it going to, if I go 100% in this, is it going to affect my health negatively? Or if I lay down and sleep for 4 days, is that going to affect things negatively? You know, there's like this back and forth of too much, too little, too much, too little sort of thing, which is very sort of Saturnian. I find at some point, I think the purpose of polarity is to show us two ends of the spectrum, right? And that there's a couple of principles with this. If you go too far to one end of the spectrum, you're going to end up at the opposite. That's just like how it goes. Like you were saying, as you go too far into darkness, eventually something will happen and it'll be light. If you go too far into light, this is something that we don't always think about, but light can be blinding, right?
Yeah.
Like we go too far into the light, we become blind, and all of a sudden it's dark.
Or like Icarus gets too close to the sun or something like that. I
Yeah.
think that's more about ego, but yeah, he
Oh
gets
yeah.
too close to the sun.
For sure. For sure, for sure. And then eventually, once we stop swinging from branch to branch and you know, from opposite to opposite, there's also the principle of slowing down enough to find the equilibrium between the two. And that is something that I think has to do with the principle of equanimity,
Mm-hmm.
which is definitely an ongoing contemplation for me, something I struggle with quite a lot. But I do think once we start studying, you know, paradoxically, when we talk about polarity, there's a lot of paradox involved, right?
Yeah.
It's just the nature of it. But paradoxically, I think when we start really leaning into polarity and noticing polarity and understanding polarity, it can actually give us a better sense of equanimity. And I'm sure we could talk more about that, but that's been my experience in archetypal work, is leaning into opposites gives me a sense of understanding and compassion for things that I find are very different than me.
Sure.
And sometimes, you know, when you're drawing tarot cards, you might get like a tarot card that, you know, subjectively might seem a little scary, like perhaps the Tower or death. Like I've done a tarot reading for myself every week for many, many, many years. It's just kind of a lifelong practice of mine. Over time, you start to see these things that you consider like the Tower or death as deep, dark, kind of like negative things. And then the things that you might consider, oh, like these are positive things like the sun or strength, or things that feel a little bit lighter or brighter because our society is obsessed with light and bright. But you start to see like, okay, I'm throwing these things down, these tarot cards, and I'm seeing both of these things. And then you watch how it plays out in your life. And the truth is, you do have challenges, right? You do have things that are really deep and dark and scary, but they lead to the light, you know?
Yeah.
And there's and then you do have these things that are beautiful and like just gorgeous and complex and lovely, but they also don't last.
Yeah.
And so you start to see this pattern over and over again of how things change and how things mold. And you start to, throw the tower down and be like, okay, that's happening. There's a sense of equanimity that comes into the picture when you're like, okay, like I can handle the opposites. The opposites aren't so scary. They're a part of this life experience. I also know that if I'm going through dark territory, that's leading me somewhere light. And if I'm going somewhere light, like I have to enjoy and appreciate it because it will eventually lead me back to the dark. This is just how this reality is set up. And there's a sense of equanimity and appreciation for both of those things, to not see one as better than the other, that comes with this work, I think.
Absolutely. And it's neither good nor bad. It just is.
Yeah.
Like energy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so with your experience with astrology, you brought up Saturn. Can you talk about a Saturn return? Because that's
Oh
a little
yeah.
bit of like a pendulum, isn't it? It just kind of comes around and
Yeah.
in a way.
Yeah, man. Saturn returns are juicy. um
It's like, what are you gonna do? That just is my interpretation of Saturn, of like question everything.
that's pretty accurate. um yeah, I think Saturn will come, so basically, just to kind of piece it apart and let our listeners know what a Saturn return is, in case they aren't aware.
Yes,
uh,
please.
so we have all these planets moving in a circle around the sun, right? And
Mhm.
so um Saturn takes about 28 to 30 years to make a full circle around the sun. So every time that basically, correlates with our living as humans when we're around 28 to 30 years old. And then once again, when we're, in our late 50s to early 60s. So essentially, if we live to past, 62 or 63, we'll have two Saturn returns in our life. We'll experience basically where Sa- the definition of Saturn return is Saturn traveling all the way around the sun and coming back to the spot where Saturn was the moment that you were born,
Mm.
right? So that's what we call a Saturn return. So usually what happens during a Saturn return is that it's a little bit of a rite of passage into adulthood, at least the first Saturn return. Like Saturn comes, and Saturn is the Lord of time. He comes along and he says, hey, guess what? You're not going to have forever. Like, time to get a little serious about your life. Because I think in terms of opposition, what that provides is, I think during the first, part of our lives, we have, childhood through, growing up and all that stuff, tend to be a little bit more yang, tend to be a little bit more solar, right? We have that Icarus feeling when we're younger, right? We're like, we just want to travel as far as we can to the sun. We have all these dreams and goals and energy and chi. And Saturn comes in and says, okay, that's only one part of life. Here's the other pole. Here's the other polarity. Also, life is serious. Also, you have to mature, you have to grow up. Also, there's death, there's darkness, there's responsibility, like there's the hard knocks of life. Saturn comes along and is kind of like our shamanic initiator in a way, to say like, hey, you know, look at this, take a look at it, and see how this might change your perspective on things, right? So as an example, everybody's Saturn return is really different, and it depends on, your charts. You can kind of generally predict generally what might happen for people's Saturn returns if you can see their chart. As an example, for me, I I had a very, very deep dark night of the soul for
Mm.
my Saturn return. And I won't go into any of the nitty gritty details, but essentially, I had some incredibly difficult health issues in my late 20s that led me to a place where I had a stroke when I was in my mid 20s due to a complication with a medication, a bunch of other things, just crazy life circumstances that just came all at once, and it led me to a place where I was in like rock bottom by my Saturn return. I was in this very, very deep, dark, cold, underground place. I felt like at that point in my life I was having, thoughts of like not wanting to be here. That was where it brought me. Like, it's not everybody has that experience, of course, with their Saturn return, but Saturn came and showed me like, yeah, like there's a reality to the idea of death, right? um and so, yeah, I spent the week of my Saturn return actually in an in treatment patient facility, just like working through some really, really deep, dark things. And from that moment, actually, that was the launching pad that brought me into my work and my
Mm.
business and all of the things that I'm really passionate about, which, I had this brush with the mental health care system here, and just really, really found that I wanted to help people suffering through deep, dark, dark nights of the soul, but in a way that went deeper than what was offered in the mental health care system, because I feel like to be quite honest, we're only scratching the surface where that's concerned.
Yeah.
Um, so Saturn, like as an example, in my life, Saturn was the teacher that brought me to the edge, and then said, like, what are you going to do about that, right? And so it was a big, scary, deep, dark maturing process. But I'm so grateful for Saturn to have shown me that polarity. And now I see that like life can have that darkness, and it can really, really, that darkness can be so rich and the fertile ground out of which, we can bloom, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Yeah, the contrast and the you were talking about learning through contrast and the polarity. I thought that was really cool. You talked about Saturn teaching you how to not do too much, or to help you to recognize when you're doing too much or not enough, and just to find that balance. Is that part of self-care, or how would you connect, or how do you feel self-care is related to polarity?
I feel like it's so intertwined with polarity, and also because we have so much in in our, like, our cultural paradigm and our conditioning that I think has some areas where the other side of the pole isn't being recognized, if that makes
Mm,
self-care can be really tricky because of that,
yeah.
right? I think that, first of all, we live in a society that is very, like I said, very young, very driven, very like push, 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 go, go, go. And implicitly, there's nothing wrong with that, but it is kind of out of balance if we're not looking at the other pole, right? And the
Totally.
other pole is rest, it's reprieve, it's, yeah, sinking deeper, surrendering, being in nature, these very, like, these deeper qualities and aspects. And what I would say about self-care is that, to be quite honest, we need both of those things to be in a good form of self-care, I think.
Yeah.
We do need the yang, and we do need the yin. Depending on what your lifestyle is like and how you grew up and where you come from, we might be a little bit more predisposed to either one. I do think, generally speaking, more predisposed to the active form, right? But not always. I don't think that that's always been me. I've never been like a super young person. um, I tend to want to lean a little bit more into the yin, actually, the rest and those gentler things. So I think in terms of self-care, it's a great place to start, actually, to figure out where you're out of balance, where that's concerned, right? Do I need more activity? Do I need to push myself a little bit, to go into things, to get out there, to, sometimes you need yang to get out there and be with a community, or push yourself out of a comfort zone, right? And do something that would be self-care in terms of those things. But also, maybe you look at your sphere and you're like, maybe that's all I'm doing is I'm going out, and I have no time to come in and rest and drink enough water, take a bath every so often. The self-care can straddle a broad spectrum, and oftentimes self-care is sold to us as being sort of more of the yin aspects of things, right? Like taking a bath, all of these like relaxing sort of things. I think it's propositioned to us in that way because we're so young as a culture.
Like, let's just go to the complete opposite and just
Yeah.
sit in water and do nothing.
Yeah. Which is great, but you
Which
can't.
is fun, it's
Yeah.
delightful, but that's not all it is.
Yeah. Right. But conjunct with that, if a lot of self-care is actually discipline, it
Mm.
is Saturnian. It's doing the things that you maybe don't necessarily want to do, but are really good for you, like actually, going out and going for a run if you need to, or like that's pushing me. Like that's like stuff that I don't love doing, but I know, like for me, I know that my balance tends to be a little bit more towards yin, so I have to be like, all right, what are the yang things that I can do today to help myself? I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to sign up for that yoga class and go out and meet people. These are things that I kind of have to push myself to do. But for me, that is self-care. It's actually balancing out the imbalance that I have in me, right? I think essentially that's what self-care can be in terms of polarity, is figuring out what isn't where is the equilibrium out of whack. And what do you need more of? I think that's kind of how I see Saturn and the polarities working through that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned gentleness. And I
Mm.
think that that's so true, that it's, dog eat dog sort of thing, and go hard. And as you said, push, push, do, do, do. It's a very, like energetic sort of society, to like constantly be external and do all the things and get everything done and accomplish, accomplish, accomplish. And, we can lose sight of the gentleness, and we can, when it comes to exercising, we can push too hard and we can exercise
Mhm.
too much and realize that no, you're like getting your cortisol up and you're stressing your body out. You need to dial it back a little bit, or you're stretching too hard and your body's freaking out, and so it's not going to let you go any further. And the overall gentleness, I think, is kind of lost, and that's something that I try to remind myself of, and the people that I work with, of, how about you dial it down a little bit?
Yeah.
How about you don't work out 7 days a week, and you give your body like a, rest day or something like that? How about that? Or how about you don't be so hard on yourself and you're hurt? Just, take a day off and let your body heal. How about that?
Right. Yeah, I think that is more of the programming that we have to work with.
For
Right.
sure.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they think that, we're computers or we're machines or something like that. And I have to actually remind people, you're a biological being. You are a human being. You are not a machine. You have, skin and bone. You are tissue. You have, all these organs and everything. Your body has a healing process. a process. So you need to allow the process and give
Mm,
yourself time instead of like pushing and striving. And yeah, so gentleness, I think, is a really key word for sure, is to
yeah,
balance out that um, exertion, I guess you
yeah,
could say. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Well, in the realm of self-care, do you have any suggestions how to cultivate or integrate the idea of polarity?
Well, I think kind of, along the lines of um, what I was talking about before, I think it could be a great opportunity for you to sit down and figure out which polarities you tend to be in
Yeah,
for
some
those things.
self-reflection.
Yeah, some self-reflection, right? Where do I tend to be more active and do I push myself too hard? Am I injuring myself because I'm exercising, all the time? We, of course, in exercise, they say like it's so important to have rest. You have to have rest in
Yeah,
in order for your body to actually build muscle, even, right?
yeah,
So like this principle applies to everything. Like there has to be some sort of balance in order for something to move forward. Yeah, I would say just sit down and do some reflection, maybe do some journaling, and come up with some words that might have to do with the more young masculine side of things, and write those down and see what those words feel like to you and how you're inhabiting those words, and then do the same with the yin words, like dark, feminine, slow, gentle, or masculine, active, bright, loud, movement, right? These opposites. And see where you feel like on a scale of 1 to 10, maybe even take like each word and say like where do you fall on those things, and then take a look at that and see where you're out of balance. And from that, you could perhaps use that as a way to form a self-care routine. Like, as an example, my partner is way more young than I am. Like he is go 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 active, thinking about things all the time, very brainy, like boom boom boom. He has found that his like the best practice for him is like an hour of meditation every day. Like he just really goes deep into meditation because he needs it, because he is so active, right? He needs a place to just calm down and settle in. Now, I have found I love meditation, but it's a little too easy for me actually. And I could just stay in meditation and not be active at all. And you know, so my medicine tends to be things that are a little bit more active. Like I have to get myself out of the house. I need to take walks. I have to go to a static dance and work my body. Like these are things that help balance me out because I'm naturally a little bit more yin, a little bit more gentle, a little bit more just like sometimes a little bit more lazy, like that's just my constitution. That's how I'm built. So I think it's important to have self-awareness of where you fall along that, which could be how it's always been. Like you might have some natal predispositions to things, or it could be a chapter of your life. Like we have chapters where we're way too young or way too young. I think that's a great way to form a self-care routine, is through that reflection. Yeah.
that's wonderful. And there might even be health conditions at that current time that could be different from other times in your life that you're having to deal with. So you're having to take a new look at it. Okay, I have to, where am I balancing with what I'm going on? Or, maybe they broke a arm or something like that. Okay, now you have to be realistic and adapt and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, that's cool. Do you have any other thoughts? Any final thoughts about polarity?
Um, yeah, I think it's just something that it's we don't need to fear it so much, you know?
Yeah,
We I think sometimes we have this negative association sometimes with polarity, or like it's very easy for us as humans to go to extremes and
sure.
to polarity. I think that the the only way out is through.
Yeah,
I think we do need to embrace our innate capacity for polarity, and that is sort of a true facet of our reality. But what really helps with the sort of uncomfortable aspects of polarity is really leaning into it and understanding the opposites and taking time to, if you're to recognize that you might be in one pole of an area, right? You might be living in one pole. Like, why don't I step into the other side and see what that's about, right? Sometimes we do need to explore those to figure out, how to work with life as a whole. And it really is like just the principle of even just being able to step into another person's shoes of whom you totally disagree with, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so polarity doesn't have to be a bad thing. In fact, it can be something that's really essential on the path to healing. But I do think we need to consciously engage with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Katrina.
You're so welcome. Thank you, Summer.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, that's our episode for this week. Please like and subscribe. It helps this podcast more than you know. And you can follow the Fierce Heart Alliance on Facebook for weekly inspiration. Check out our website at fierceheartalliance.com to get your free guide for how to work with the virtues yourself. Next week is our integration episode for the virtue of polarity, where I share a channeling from my guides. Take care, Fierce Hearts. Till next time.